Welcome back, and it's just 11 minutes past 1 o'clock here, which means I've got my first guest on the programme today, and that is Adam Deen of the Deen Institute in the United Kingdom. Good afternoon, Adam.
Good afternoon.
Thanks very much for joining us today. Now then, of course, ongoing questions, new questions raised all the time about how we deal with, I suppose, the way we think about what's going on in the wider world regarding Islam and the extreme fundamentalism that some seem to be using Islam to promote their violent aims. And certainly I'm not very comfortable at all with even trying to have to imagine Islam in the same context as the kind of values that these people seem to be upholding. Of course, we're talking about those that other people would refer to as terrorists. And I'm constantly searching for answers, and that's why I've asked you on today. What I want to ask you, Adam, is as a spokesperson for a very highly esteemed organisation where you use philosophy to defend Islam, let me ask you, contemporary philosophy, should I say, to defend Islam, let me ask you, first of all, how you feel that Islam needs to be defended at the moment. That in itself is quite an issue, no?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, the Islamic faith has been hijacked, and it's been hijacked by a particular type of reading or brand of Islam that is completely antithetical to the underpinning values of Islam. Islam is effectively a humanistic religion in that it's based upon values like justice and seeking the good for all. And unfortunately, we have this type of what I would refer to a puritanical reading of Islam, which completely disfigures and almost vandalizes the faith. And this has been a problem that's stretching back a decade or so, and that is down to the question of where is this kind of reading of Islam coming from, and unfortunately it's coming from places where our governments in the West supports, for example, Saudi Arabia, which has a brand of Islam known as Wahabism, and Wahabism, in a sense, is a puritanical reading of Islam. And what that puritanical reading of Islam does effectively is that it tries to implement what it perceives to be Sharia law, and I use that word very loosely, at the expense of ethical norms, at the expense of ethics, and it really does empty Islam empties Islam of its moral and ethical content. And for everyday Muslims, moderate Muslims, witnessing this, and there's a disproportionate amount of airtime these individuals get, obviously because of their actions, the entire faith, in the eyes of non-Muslims, and Muslims as well, for that matter, people in the West, is completely disfigured.
Now, I'm glad you said that, the disproportionate amount of airtime, because, that's really what this is about, isn't it? That, I'm actually quite surprised at the moment when I turn on the television and I'm seeing quite a lot of coverage of this crisis in the Ukraine, because for some time it's been nothing but Islam. Of course, now what's happening in Syria and Iraq is headline news once again because of what happened with the latest hostage, or the latest revelations of what happened with the hostage, albeit that he was killed a month ago. And that shines yet again a very, very negative light on Islam. However, it does bring something else into the equation, and that is that, here we have a Muslim country that has been affected directly by this extremism.
Yeah, and that's quite an eye-opener for lots of people, that, the problems that we have with this type of reading of Islam, this kind of extreme understanding of Islam, it affects Muslims. And in actual fact, statistics show that more Muslims die from Muslim extremism than non-Muslims. They're always on the receiving end of their acts. And this is a grave concern for us. And what the community has to do, and this is why I've had a lot of backlash, is to... the problem we have with the Muslim community is that anti-Muslim and Islamophobic hate crime is on the rise. A great portion of Muslims who are just, or sometimes even nominally Muslim, are affected by sort of the backlashes. And given that environment, given that hostile environment that they're experiencing, which is akin to sort of racism or anti-Semitism, Muslims find it very hard to accept and digest critical introspection. And it's very difficult for them to actually criticize their community. But we have to be honest that there is a fringe element that has a big mouth within the community, that has means of pushing their agenda, if you like, within the Muslim community, that is masquerading as moderate or mainstream Islam, and the Muslim community have to out this out. And say and be honest and say, yes, this is nothing to do with Islam, but we do have elements within our community that we need to address and root them out, and that's really key for the Muslim community. We have to be clear and we have to be direct and say this is a cancer that we need to cut out.
Adam, in that respect, we're looking at, cutting out that cancer, and if we're focusing, say, for the United Kingdom, where you're speaking to us from, stopping the radicalisation of young Muslim men, which obviously requires the immense input from those Muslim religious leaders, those Muslim respected community leaders. They have to be involved in this. But that's a real battle, is it not, when there is so much media attention on the negatives around Islam and around the mutations of Islam, that most people who don't have the time or the desire to really look underneath the mainstream media will just take on face value.
Absolutely. I mean, the continual negative portrayals of Muslims has an effect on wider society's perspective on Muslims and Islam, and that is a battle that we're facing. At the same time, the moderate voice, it's not as if there aren't any moderate Muslims speaking out, but their voices are drowned by the disproportionate voices of extremist Muslims within the media. And that's a problem. That's a major problem that we have. And, I did a documentary recently with Panorama, and I think that was a move in the right direction, that we've got alternative voices now that are coming out in the media saying, this is not Islam. These people do not represent Muslims, to try and balance that out. But that is a major challenge, absolutely.
Now, where's the most important place to direct that message? Is it at the average man in the street in a country like England, or is it at the schools in communities within the United Kingdom? Where do we start with something like this?
Well, that's very. I think that's a good point. I think it needs to be sort of on the ground at schools, at universities. That kind of positive image of Islam. One of the great things about that documentary, when I got a lot of backlash from sort of extremist Muslims, because I was pointing the finger at ourselves to say, look, we may need to work on these areas within our community. But the positive thing that I got were a lot of non-Muslims that actually said, look, this was the first time I saw a kind of version of Islam, an Islam that I could relate to, and that's really, really important. It only takes one positive image to do away with 10 negative images, as long as it's argued cogently and honestly. And I think that's a very good point. We do need to spread this message within the schools. We need Muslim ambassadors to visit schools and to give a positive view of Islam and to deal with the kind of misconceptions.
There is intense integration within schools in England these days, and lots of multi-faith educational establishments. And I'm assuming, Adam, that at some points you probably do speak within those environments, do you?
Yes, of course. Yes, I've been invited to various schools to.
So what's your feeling? What kind of what's happening in schools, within the community, within the school, the children themselves, who tend to be more open-minded than a lot of adults who've made up their minds that this is how it is and they're not going to change. How do you feel? Is there positive feeling in schools?
It is positive, but I think, again, children, like adults within the same society, are affected by the media. And, if we played a word association game with some children at school and we said Muslim or Islam, I'd pretty much bet my hat on the fact that the first word they would utter would be violence or some kind of terrorism of some sort. And the concern is, how those Muslim, children, our students, are also going to be affected by that negative portrayal as well. It is an upward struggle. But I think what's happening now is that we are having a internal battle within the community, the Muslim community. One of moderate Islam and one of extremist Islam, and it's an ongoing struggle that we need to continue with. And we also need the support of non-Muslims that are sort of honest and objective and realise, Islam for what it is, to also spread the word as well.
Does it mean that Islam has to change, if we're talking about Islam communities in the West specifically?
Islam does not have to change. What needs to change is Islam in the minds of Muslims.
Right.
The way that they perceive Islam has to be changed. In that respect, there needs to be a reformation. Yeah.
Right. Let me ask you as well, Adam, if we go back to Wahabism, as you've stated, it's ancient, isn't it? It's far too in-depth to cover now. But if we look at that as having grown within the environment in Saudi Arabia and, based very much on Sharia law and so on, again, it's a big question and I'm asking you to put it in a nutshell, but where did we see the mutation of of that Wahabism, of that Sharia law, of those ideals, mutated into actually use of terror to gain an end? And what does it mean?
Okay, that's a very, very, very important question. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time.
No,
I'm
sorry to put you on the spot.
So I'll try and do as much justice to your question as I can. So what I argue is that Wahabism, which is by definition a puritanical version of Islam, which is very much infiltrated and spread within the Western world and also in the UK. What it does, it provides a theological foundation which then acts as a precursor for violent extremism. It provides certain, I'd say, toxic theological ideas, which then provides an oxygen for extremist violence. So, for example, the kind of ideas that they have is a very binary outlook of the world, that anything that's good, anything that's holy, that's anything that's virtuous is only on the Islamic side, and anyone else who is non-Muslim or the West is completely opposite of that. And what that does, that has a very crude, dualistic way of looking at the world, and it means that you're creating the other. And in philosophy, they'd refer to that as making the other an epistemic object. They are mere objects. And if you sort of speak to these extremist Muslims, the way in which they talk of non-Muslims is as if they're subhuman. And this is a trait in war crimes, where they see the opponent as almost subhuman, and they lose all empathy for that person. And when you do that, when you create a world where, in crude binary terms, that furnishes a potential environment for someone to commit acts of violence. So if you look at, for example, Lee Rigby's killers, they regarded Lee Rigby, Michael Adebaloja, regarded Lee Rigby as a term called kafar, which means someone who is not a Muslim. But the actual word itself is not. Again, it's a mutated version of that understanding of that word. Kafar actually means someone who's ostentatiously against Islam, who disbelieves. They're applying these terms, misapplying these terms, and then using them a way of dehumanizing individuals. Also, when we've got this kind of binary outlook, which is very crude, that anything on the side of Islam is all holy and virtuous, and anything outside of that is something that is evil and that is bad. And that does away with the middle ground. And the middle ground is essential to coexist with people that are different than yourself, that have different values, different ideas. That is completely obliterated with this kind of puritanical outlook of the world. Another problem, another kind of theological problem, is that they want to implement Sharia at the expense of ethical norms. Regardless of the context, you may call it literalism if you like. This is a major problem as well. And this is the type of teaching, I mean, there are other features that I could go into, but we don't have the time, but these are the type of toxic theological ideas that Wahhabism is teaching, is spreading amongst the Muslim youth. Now, think of it like this. Saudi Arabia has spent $100 billion in the last 10 years spreading its Wahhabi reading of Islam. That's 10 times more than the former Soviet Union spent during the Cold War, spreading its message. So this is what we're up against.
And when you say spreading its message, we're talking about, ideologically, geographically.
Schools, funding schools, speakers, organisations, books. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, the first bookshops that were opening up in the UK were sponsored by a Wahhabi reading. You'd walk in there, the only books that you would have would be Saudi Wahhabi authors. You own the library, you own the mind.
Now, you would expect, Adam, that would be successful in an ancient world or in a community, for example, in the outreaches of Pakistan, where there is no access, perhaps, to information. But nowadays, with such great access to information and information that can counter the sort of brainwashing, I suppose, that might take place with Wahhabism, then how has it been so successful? Why?
It's because it's well-financed. The appeal to Wahhabi Islam will dry up when the oil dries up in Saudi Arabia. You're talking about millions and millions of pounds are spent propagating this type of reading of Islam. Moderate, sensible, open-minded Muslims who are in touch with their rich intellectual history, are reasonably minded. They don't have those facilities. They don't have that manpower. We're up against a machine. Unfortunately, it's almost like the Walmart equivalent, completely buying out and consuming every other type of opposition.
Incredibly fascinating. And what again, in a nutshell, Adam, what is the ultimate aim of those preaching Wahhabism? What is it?
Well, the aim is not necessarily for violence, but it is to preach a type of reading of Islam which is very, very schismatic, very, very. I mean, Wahhabism, its history has a sort of sinister past. It was actually established by means of violence, which is it's not surprising now that those very same individuals now in the 21st century are causing havoc in the world.
Fascinating. Adam Deen, I wish we had more time. I do hope that we can speak again. Adam Deen of the Deen Institute, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Pippa Jones on TR.